folks. This is Yair Netanyahu. I'm starting a new podcast. This is my first episode. I had a few episodes of podcasts several years ago, and now I'm renewing my podcast. So you can follow me on my YouTube page and any other podcast platform you're used to get your podcast at. Today I'm with Colonel Richard Kemp, who is a former commander in the British Army, and a friend of mine and my family. Richard, good to see you. How are you?
Great to see you. Good to join you as well.
Pleasure. What an honor to have you as my first guest of my podcast. So, Richard, for the folks that are watching and are not familiar with who you are, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, about your service in the British Army in the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan?
Yeah, how long have you got? I've got quite a long CV.
In a nutshell.
Essentially, I was in the British Army for 30 years. And during that time, I served a number of operational tours in Northern Ireland, which is kind of the closest you could get to it now in the current context is probably what's going on in Judea and Samaria. I served in the Balkans with the United Nations peacekeeping force there. And I served in Iraq on two different occasions, and Afghanistan. At the end of my military service, I worked for the Prime Minister of the UK, Tony Blair. I was responsible for international terrorism intelligence for about 5 years, and also chairman of the intelligence group of COBRA, which is our crisis management, our National Crisis Management Committee. And since then, I've been pretty much my own boss, and I spend quite a lot of time writing and speaking, and sometimes doing consultancy work. So that's basically, in a nutshell, that's me.
So I've met you many times in Israel, and I know since October 7, you visited Israel multiple times, and you've been to the north when there was an active war with Lebanon, and you've been to Gaza Strip many, many times, including, I think, just a month ago. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Recording on July 2025. So you've been pretty recently, right?
Yeah, I've been a number of times with the IDF, and also since October 2023. And also I've been a couple of times to visit the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation inside Gaza. And that was the last time was about, as you say, about 4 weeks ago.
Can you tell us about this fund for the people that don't know what it is and what is its purpose?
Yeah, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, it's much maligned in the media in particular and among the United Nations and other human rights, so-called human rights groups. What it is, it's a private American enterprise, private money, and it aims to get aid to Gazan civilians directly and in secure locations without actually going through the hands of Hamas, which, as you know, pretty much all the other aid delivered by the UN, much of it gets hijacked. It gets sold at premium prices in the markets to raise money for Hamas terrorists, and Hamas take, of course.
How do they hijack it when it's the UN aid distributors?
Well, the UN trucks, the UN trucks or the other aid agency trucks will go in and they'll simply surround it, jump on it, and take what they want, which is, often 90% or even in some cases all of it. So very little aid through the normal system actually gets directly into the hands of Palestinians. And when I visited the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation sites, many Gazans, I met thousands, I saw thousands of Gazans, I spoke to probably about 100 of them directly. And many of them told me this is the first time since the war began that they've actually received free aid as opposed to having to pay exorbitant prices, which of course goes into Hamas's coffers. So that's what the GHF tries to do.
Just to explain for people that didn't understand. So basically, whether it's the regular United Nations delivery of the aid, Hamas just take over the trucks and steal it all to itself. And then instead of giving it for free for the Palestinians in Gaza, for the civilians, as it's supposed to be officially by the United Nations, Hamas is selling this aid, this food, for a lot of money to its own population, and then this is how they get their money to this terrorist organization. So the GHF, this new American humanitarian fund, they are delivering the food directly to the Gazan civilians without Hamas stealing it and without Hamas then selling it for a high price. So they get it for free. So all the humanitarian organizations and everybody in Europe and in the world and the Arab world is supposed to be very happy, right? Supposedly, for this free delivery of aid and food for the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. So why they're all against it?
Well, I mean, the primary purpose of the GHF is to get aid to the Gazan civilians, but also to prevent Hamas from, one, making money for it from terrorist purposes, or two, using it to control the civilian population, because whoever controls the aid controls the civilian population. Now, the UN don't like that because it's outside of their system. And of course, as we all know, the UN and UNRWA in particular, which is the main element of the UN in Gaza, they're obviously aligned with Hamas. They share the same, most of them are Gazan civilians who are under the influence of Hamas. And they don't like the system, they don't want the system. And bizarrely, what we've got is a situation in Gaza now, or not in Gaza, but in the world, where both the UN and Hamas are speaking with one voice on the GHF. They're condemning it. That's quite a bizarre thing. A terrorist organization and the United Nations is condemning it. In the negotiations that recently took place in Qatar, one of the priorities that Hamas laid down as their requirement was to remove the GHF, to shut the GHF down, which shows how effective the GHF's being and how damaging it is to Hamas's continued grip on Gaza.
So you were in Gaza a month ago. What did you see? Did you see starvation like in Africa, in Sudan, or in Yemen? Did you see, walking skeletons like we saw the Jewish survivors in the German camps that were liberated in the end of World War II, as the anti-Semite propagandists trying to brainwash the Western world? What did you see in your own eyes when you were in Gaza?
Well, as I said, I saw thousands and thousands of Gazans at these GHF sites, and I spoke to about 100 of them. I saw no sign anywhere of weak people, of people who were emaciated or obviously very, very hungry. I saw a lot of people who obviously wanted food and needed food, but they were lively. There were no skeletal figures whatsoever. They were extremely happy, and obviously they're not happy with the overall situation in Gaza. Of course they're not, but they were very happy to be receiving this free aid. And I heard many of them saying, "I love America. I love Trump," because of course they associate Trump and America with this new aid. And the other thing I heard most often, I think, from the Gazan people I spoke to and were alongside was, "I hate Hamas. Kill Hamas." These are the words. And when people said that, there were cheers from all those around them. So very clearly, although they can't do anything about Hamas, or maybe don't want to do anything about Hamas, they recognize that it's Hamas that has brought them to this situation they're in now. Obviously, they hate Israel. That goes without saying. They've been bred to hate Israel since they were born. But I think they also realize that none of this would be happening to them if it hadn't been for what Hamas did on the 7th of October 2023.
So I have several things to add on top of this. So first of all, we know that several of these famous pictures of the starving, skeleton-like children and babies that were on the cover of all this Western, liberal papers that you have in Europe and in the United States were actually children with medical condition, like a genetic medical condition. And you see their mothers holding them, and the mother is obese. with double chin, like super fat. I've never encountered in history a situation when there is starvation and famine and the parents are obese and the children are starving and looking like skeletons. This is ridiculous. Obviously, the parents will give the food to the children, right? If there is famine, it will be everybody will be equally skeleton-like. And in one instance of one of these children that I forgot his name, that it was exposed what is his name, his parents' name, and everything. And then you see the versions of the zoom in that they only showing this child that has this medical genetic condition, and then you have a zoom out picture with his parents. They are looking very well, very healthy, a little bit fat, and his own brother, who's also looking normal, like any normal kid, and not malnourished. So this is unbelievable. There is so much propaganda and like blood libels of the Middle Ages. It's unbelievable. We said, especially that you can refute this so easily in the internet age. You have people uploading starving children from Yemen from 2015 and saying this is Gaza from now. And then, there is the Grok or the AI, whatever, correct it and say this picture was taken from Yemen, from whatever. Or there is pictures of AI, right? That you see the malnourished child with 20 digits in each palm, right? This is ridiculous. At least do it properly. And when you're doing AI and stuff like that, at least do the parents starving as well. And don't always, there is not a single picture of an adult starving in Gaza. This is ridiculous. Israel is entering tons of trucks inside. It's waiting inside Gaza in the last few weeks, and the United Nations refused to deliver it. Maybe if you know the situation, and it's not like I'm saying it. This is like videos of journalists that Israel got inside this, inside the Gaza Strip to record with video with drones. This dozens of trucks with like more food than than the whole Gaza Strip need, just waiting there in the sun and rotten while the United Nations refused to deliver it.
And what made the UN? The UN have just started. They've just resumed delivery of some of it. And you know what made them do that? Exactly what you just said. The IDF bringing journalists into Gaza, inside Gaza, to see these stockpiles themselves. So the UN were exposed for failing to do their job and exploiting this situation on behalf of Hamas. And only when they got caught out have they started again with the deliveries.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And also, as you said before, the United Nations have their main, branch or organization that operates in Gaza is UNRWA. Now, we know there is video recordings of that. This is not, we got their names. Everything is published like long ago. That UNRWA UN employees participated in the October 7 massacre. High rank UNRWA Gaza, because again, UNRWA workers in Gaza are just Gazans. They're not like somebody from abroad, from Europe, from America. They're local Gazans, and Gaza is controlled by Hamas, this terrorist organization, and a lot of them participated in the massacre. I met a mother of one of the hostages. Her name is Ayelet Samerno. I met her a few months ago. Her son was murdered and kidnapped. His body was kidnapped by an UNRWA employee. And it's all on record. It's all caught in the security cameras of this little town that it happened. She's trying, she's traveling across Europe and America, trying to confront UN officials, trying to confront UNRWA officials for what they did to her son, and there's nobody care. After a lot of the horrors that have been done by UNRWA employees being exposed, there was a brief period of time that the United Nations were like, oh, we need to go to the bottom of this. This is very severe, blah, blah, blah. European countries stopped donating for UNRWA. And then after a few months, it's not like it was discovered that all the facts are not true, that the UNRWA employees participated in the massacres. It's all true. It's like nobody even argue anything else. Even the United Nations is not arguing that it's not true. But everybody just forgot about it, and they renewed, all the European countries renewed their funding for UNRWA, and the United Nations are back to demanding UNRWA to operate in Gaza, although it was revealed that UNRWA is basically embedded in Hamas. The army, the Israeli army, when went inside Gaza after October 7, found in all of the UNRWA UN facilities, caches of weapons, of RPGs, of bombs, of ammunition. They found entrances and exits of terror tunnels of Hamas that they used to, to hide hostages and use it for their terrorist activities. So this is unbelievable, and nobody care. You also said something about the civilian population that are anti-Hamas. Maybe now, because of they understand what Hamas have caused them, and to the Gaza Strip and to their families, they are anti-Hamas. But it's not because they had, on October 7, not a single Gazan civilian was anti-Hamas. They were all delighted. There is countless of videos of Gazan civilians, the first wave of invaders inside Israel were the Nukhba Hamas terrorists. But once the border was breached, and and the terrorists were carrying on the massacres, there was a second wave of Gazan civilians entering Israel with flip-flops, with shorts, with whatever, just looting, raping, pillaging, murdering just random civilians that they encountered in the music festival in Nova or in the little towns and villages across the border. A lot of them kidnapped and brought back hostages themselves. I met several times with the hostage Noa Argamani, that her brutal kidnap was photographed with a video, and it became very famous. The next day, it was on the cover. Her face was on the cover of several big newspapers. I think it was also on the cover of the Daily Mail. And she and her boyfriend, who is still a hostage in Gaza, were kidnapped by Gazan civilians. It was not Hamas terrorists. It was just random Gaza civilians that came in, crossed the border, and found them at the party and took them. And so we need to remember, there's countless of videos of hostages paraded in the streets of Gaza. Some of them are dead. Some of them are dismembered. Some of them are alive. Women, children, babies, elderly people, they're all paraded in the main streets of Gaza on October 7, and the crowds are cheering and spitting on them and hitting them and slapping them, including the children, including the women, including the elderly people. Even in Nazi Germany, there were many instances of German civilians, German people, and even Nazi officials that saved Jews. For example, Oskar Schindler saved thousands of Jews, and he was officially a member of the Nazi party. So, and now in Gaza, with 2 million people, we don't have one instance of righteous among the nations like we had in Nazi Germany and Nazi-occupied Europe, of someone who's saving one hostage and smuggling one hostage out of the border, beyond the lines to the Israeli army, or even calling the Israeli army or whatever, calling and giving information where's the hostages. And the hostages are embedded among the civilians. Most of the hostages accounts, the hostages that were freed, out of, I think, 300 and something hostages, we freed about 200 and something. And most of them giving testimonies that they were held in private homes of private Gaza civilians that were keeping them, torturing them, starving them, and it was all by Gazan civilians, not by Gazan, not by Hamas officials. There are many instances of hostages managed to break free and run away, and Gaza civilians catching them and in the street and returning them to Hamas. So this population is living under a Nazi regime for more than 20 years, since, well, you can say since Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005, but to be honest, it's actually since the Oslo Accords, since 1994, when Israel created the Palestinian Authority out of the PLO, which was a terrorist organization responsible for countless of terror attacks and hijack of airplanes and bombing the Olympics and stuff like that. And that was the worst deal in history. Israel brought this terror organization from Tunisia, brought them into Israel and created the Palestinian Authority, armed them, and gave them total control on the education of the Palestinian youth and the media. And since then, Palestinian society is under a Nazi propaganda regime. Even the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank, that is considered the moderates. So a quarter of their budget of the Palestinian Authority, the moderates, right, of Mahmoud Abbas, is going for salaries of terrorists that murdered Jewish and Christian children and women and elderly, or if they were killed during the terror attack, so to their families. It's a quarter of the budget of the Palestinian Authority. By the way, where's the budget coming from? They don't produce anything. 100% of the budget of the Palestinian Authority comes from the European taxpayer, the British taxpayer, and the American taxpayer. So a quarter of this money at least goes to terrorism. They're naming streets and football stadiums and squares after terrorists that murder children and call them national heroes. And this is the moderate Palestinian Authority, right?
So and it's not just the funding of terrorism and the encouragement, the supporting and direction of terrorism from the Palestinian Authority. It's also, as in Gaza, in Judea and Samaria as well, it's the indoctrination of the children, the education of the children, the supply of textbooks, films, all other forms of education are funded by us, by the taxpayer.
Yeah.
Normally through the United Nations. So the United Nations schools in all of these places are hugely implicated in the indoctrination of the children of Gaza, to the extent their level of radicalization, exactly as you described earlier, where ordinary people can invade Israel on the heels of Hamas, and ordinary people can beat, spit at, abuse ordinary Israeli civilians being dragged into their territory. So it's not only terrorism, it's also the whole indoctrination process that we've been paying for.
It's also important to note that Mein Kampf is the most popular book in Palestinian Authority in Gaza after the Quran. And there's many shops and restaurants named after Hitler. There's many Israeli soldiers that got inside houses in Gaza to check for terrorist infrastructure. Found many paintings on the wall of Hitler and stuff like that. And you got the Piers Morgan constant saying, so do you think their children growing up now in this war would love you more? Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005. Why do they hate us so much? We gave them 100% of their demands. Israel controlled the Gaza Strip, not inside the Palestinian cities since 1994 in the Oslo Accords, but so in the open areas of the Gaza Strip, and there were Jewish settlements in the Gaza Strip, Israeli civilians that were living there for generations. They had graveyards. They had synagogues and greenhouses and a flourishing agriculture communities. In Israel, kicked out 10,000 Israeli Jews that were living there for generations in 2005 in the disengagement, and ruined the synagogues and took the bodies out of the graves in the graveyards, left nothing but infrastructure and greenhouses for the Palestinians, handed the keys to the Palestinian moderate Palestinian Authority. That was in 2005. In 2006, Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip, kicked off the roofs the Palestinian Authority officials. The Palestinian Authority officials actually, they were, running to the Israeli border, asking for refuge from Israel because the Hamas were killing them. So Israel pulled out until the last inch of what's it called, the green line of what's the UN, whatever, demands of the Palestinian state in Gaza. We gave them a state. Gaza was a de facto Palestinian state from 2005 without a single Israeli soldier. They had a border with Egypt. They said, there was a blockade. They had a border with a fellow Arab Muslim country, Egypt. Israel cannot control this border between Egypt and Gaza, as we saw, because Egypt let in deliberately to the Hamas to smuggle all their weapons and all their rockets and all the weapons they used for the October 7 massacre was used by weapons smuggled from Egypt. So obviously we did not control this border. So why did they kept firing rockets on us all this year since 2005, where they got their own state until the last inch of their demands? They could do whatever they want. They got tens of and hundreds of billions of dollars of aid from pouring in from Europe, the Arab world, America, all from hardworking taxpayer money of American citizens and European and British citizens. Why didn't they took all this money and made the Gaza Strip, which is along the beautiful Mediterranean coast, why didn't they make it into Singapore or Dubai? They took all this money either for the corruption and self benefit of the leaders of Hamas, or they used it, or mostly what they did with it is used it to build terrorist infrastructure, the biggest underground complex in the world. They used it to build rockets and to eventually to invade Israel and to rape and behead and murder and kidnap and torture and burn alive 1,200 Israeli citizens, including many children and many babies and many elderly people, and also kidnapped 300 and something Israeli civilians. By the way, they killed and kidnapped not just Israeli, but many Americans, many Russians, maybe many Thai citizens from Thailand, and British and European civilians, but nobody really cares. Were you surprised from how quick the world forgot October 7 and turned on Israel?
No, not at all.
A few weeks after.
We've seen the world heavily influenced by the media, of course. Organizations like the BBC and CNN and other Western media. We've seen how they've been against Israel for many, many years now, how there's been a consistent, well-orchestrated propaganda campaign against Israel. So it was only going to be a matter of days before they reverted to that. They had to, in some cases, they had to take the opportunity to kind of pause for.
Richard, you've been serving as part of NATO mission to Afghanistan and Iraq. the British Army and the American Army and several other NATO allies were there for 20 years. And there is an estimation of several millions of civilians, of Afghan and Iraqi civilians that were killed as part of, the war. This is what's going on in wars. I don't remember the whole world is going crazy after the UK and America and calling, and I don't remember, and calling them genocidal, countries that do a genocide against an ethnic cleansing against the Iraqi people and the Afghan people. I don't remember the ICC issuing arrest warrants against Barack Obama and George W. Bush and the British Prime Minister or the other European Prime Minister and leaders that were involved in NATO in those countries, although there were millions of civilians that were killed during these wars. And we have an estimation of 40 plus thousand casualties in Gaza. And it's urban warfare in the most densely populated area in the world, where Hamas is fighting from within hospitals and schools and within the population. They don't have military camps. They are fighting from within the population. They're using their own population as human shield. And most estimations that the majority of these casualties are Hamas terrorists. And I think there's this ratio of civilians to combat casualties. And I think that Israel has about 1-to-1. For every civilian killed, it is there is one combatant Hamas terrorist that killed as well. Well, where for America and Britain in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think it was something like 1-to-3. So for every one Al Qaeda or whatever combatant in Afghanistan and Iraq, there were 3 civilians killed. So Israel is doing stuff that no other army, including no other Western army, not America, not Europe, ever did, which is fighting a war and supplying gas and electricity and water and food and medicine to its enemies. Usually countries are not responsible for enemies' civilian population. I mean, nobody expected the UK and America to supply Nazi Germany with food and aid and electricity and gas during the World War II. There were millions of innocent Germans that were killed during World War II by Allied bombing. There was a famous incident of an Allied bombing in Denmark targeting Nazi-occupied Denmark by the British, targeting one of the Nazis' infrastructure, and the missile missed its target and accidentally hit a disabled children hospital and killed about 500 Danish disabled children. But nobody says that, the UK, well, now you have in the woke rights that say that the UK, that Churchill was the bad guy. But, no, Nazi Germany were the bad guys. They were deliberately killing civilians in gas chambers, in holes that that would make their Jewish victims, take them to the woods and force them to dig out holes in the woods and then firing to all, the women and children, everybody into the pit. And then, and of course, there was the death camps of, Auschwitz and all the other was factories for death, where every day hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, of Jewish civilians were murdered deliberately. And that's exactly the difference between America and the UK on the one hand and Nazi Germany on the other hand. It's the exact difference of what we had with Hamas and the Palestinians deliberately murdering children and women and elderly and civilians. They encountered them face to face in the music festival, in the villages around the Gaza Strip inside Israel and deliberately beheaded them with a knife, deliberately shot them in the head, deliberately raped them, and then murdered them while they're gang raping them. So this is one thing. And then there's another thing when a Western, democratic country like Israel, like the UK, like America, having its army targeting terrorists and accidentally kill civilians because this is an urban warfare. So this stuff happens in every single war in history, by America, by the UK, by every single Western country that ever fought, including in modern age. So, how come that, the world doesn't see it? How come that after 9/11, the world united, rightfully so, the world stood behind America and sent its soldiers to Afghanistan and to Iraq on behalf of America because of what happened in 9/11, and supported the American war definitely in Afghanistan when it came to destroying Al-Qaeda because of what they did in 9/11. This is America, invading and taking over two countries on the other side of the world. Gaza is few miles away from, it's on the border of Israel. It's few miles away from Tel Aviv, from Jerusalem. Our whole country is in the size of New Jersey. When they were far, besides the October 7, when they invaded and occupied part of our land unprovokedly, without any reason, they invaded our country, took over our towns, took over this, music rave, and murdered and raped and kidnapped our civilians. They were also firing rockets to our civilian towns for 15 years since 2005. I'm sorry, for 20 years, since 2005, and even from before, deliberately targeting our civilians while hiding behind their civilians, firing those rockets on our towns from inside hospitals, from inside schools, from inside mosques. So all the facts are known. And so how come the world's reaction is not supporting Israel when it's fighting for its life the same way when America was fighting Al-Qaeda after 9/11?
Well, you've kind of described the overall picture fairly well, I think. I don't know how many people were killed, how many civilians were killed in Afghanistan and Iraq, but I do know that British and American and other allied forces did kill large numbers of civilians, accidentally, of course, in the same way as Israel has killed large numbers of civilians in Gaza, accidentally. There's no targeting by the US Army, the British Army, or the IDF of civilians. And the IDF take the most extraordinary measures to protect the lives of innocent civilians on the battlefield, sometimes even to the extent of their own soldiers dying in the process of saving civilian lives, which is something that's never spoken about, but is the reality. And you mentioned the ratios between civilian and combatant deaths. From the best data I've got, and I don't say it's perfect, but from the best data I've got, I think the IDF has been responsible probably for killing about one civilian, as you said, to every one combatant, something of that sort. Maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less. But if you compare that to to Afghanistan, Allied forces, by American estimates, killed around 5 civilians for every combatant.
Wow.
And in Iraq, it was around 3 to 1. And the United Nations wrote a report a few years ago saying that in urban conflict since the Second World War, the death rate between civilians and military in all wars has been about 9 civilians for every combatant killed. So if those measures are all correct, then the IDF have done an extraordinary job. And you have to consider another factor which didn't really apply so much in Afghanistan and Iraq. Yes, the terrorists there use human shields, but the whole strategy of Hamas is to try and force the IDF to kill as many civilians as possible. They want the civilians to die. They want their own civilians to be killed. And they try and create this situation in every way they can, including the use of human shields, and also, of course, including the whether it's reality or fiction, but creating at least an illusion of widespread starvation around Gaza. So all of these things are intended to get the international community to condemn Israel, to vilify Israel, to hate Israel, to isolate Israel. And this is just the current point. It's a very, very bad point, and in a way, it's a really low point in a very long anti-Israel propaganda campaign. And you don't get to hear the reality. Very rarely in the Western media will you get a balanced view. They won't report when Israel does something like working hard to protect innocent civilians. You will get a vast amount of coverage when something goes wrong, when civilians do unfortunately die. And the blame can be pinned on Israel, whether it's due to Israel or not, which is very often is not the case. And so you've got a kind of widespread situation where the narrative, the agenda, is set against Israel, and this is in many Western media organizations. And even just recently, there was a letter exposed by a British journalist showing BBC guidance, which effectively, I won't go into the full detail of it now, but effectively made sure that BBC coverage was slanted against Israel. So this is the nature of the problem. Whatever Israel does, Israel is wrong. Whatever happens to Israel, Israel has it coming. And it stems all the way back to the 1960s when the Soviet Union turned for a religious war by the Arabs against the Jews. They turned that into a war of national liberation, created the Palestinian people, branded Israel the occupiers, the thieves of it, and the illegal settlers of Palestinian land, all completely wrong. And from there, we've seen it develop over the years with some very sophisticated campaigning to the situation we've got today. And I would say that I speak to quite a lot of people about the situation in Israel and in Gaza, in England and elsewhere in the United States. And a lot of otherwise very intelligent people and knowledgeable people, they will condemn Israel because they simply don't know the facts. They know what the BBC says. They know what CNN says. They know what the New York Times prints. They don't know the reality for themselves. So they listen to this hugely biased media. But despite all of that, there are still a very large number of people in the UK, certainly. I would say the majority of people in the UK are on Israel's side. Most of these people are not, they don't go out in the streets, protest and shout loudly. They just quietly know what's going on because they recognize, in many cases, they recognize that the war Israel's fighting in Gaza and elsewhere in the Middle East is not just a war for Israel, it's a war for the whole of the Western world. Because, for example, if Hamas was allowed to come out of this conflict intact in any way, if they weren't roundly defeated, as I'm confident they will be, but if they weren't, then think of the encouragement that gives to jihadists everywhere around the world. And people like Emmanuel Macron, who reward terrorism by saying he's going to recognize a so-called state of Palestine, what that does, that emboldens the terrorists in France, the jihadists in France, and he will reap what he has sown from that, unfortunately, as will the other European leaders who have done similar things and who condemn Israel completely unjustly, including our own Prime Minister here in the UK, who does it not because he doesn't know the facts. I'm pretty confident he knows the reality about what's going on in Gaza. He is under such immense pressure from the supporters of the Labour Party and many of his MPs to simply pile on the condemnations of Israel. So his foreign policy is being guided not by the reality, not by the facts, but by the prejudice, anti-Israel prejudice of so many people that he wants their votes.
Yes, I want to elaborate on several points he said. First of all, it's true. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, was created in 1964 by the KGB, by the Soviet Union, as part of their global endeavor to sabotage American interests around the world and American allies around the world. 1964, when the Palestinian Liberation Organization was created, 100% of Gaza were in Arab hands, in Egypt, by Egypt. 100% of the West Bank, so-called, Judea and Samaria, so-called West Bank, and East Jerusalem were under the control of Jordan, an Arab Muslim country. So in their charter, they said they elaborate which, they specify what is Palestine that they want to liberate. And it says, we don't want to, of course, create Palestine in the lands of Gaza Strip that belongs to Egypt and the West Bank that belongs to Jordan. Of course not. We want to create our state in Tel Aviv, in West Jerusalem, in Haifa, basically on top of the ruins of the state of Israel, because they were created in Jordan, and they were not too creative when they picked up the flag for this new terrorist organization, which is today's the Palestinian flag, because they simply copied the Jordanian flag one by one, and just the same color. They didn't even switch the order of the stripes. The same color, the same order. They just took off the little white star out of the red triangle, and the Jordanian and Palestinian flags are identical. 80% of the Kingdom of Jordan residents describes themselves as Palestinian. So this is very interesting. If Israel is the Jewish country where 80% are Jews in Israel, why isn't Jordan is Palestine? If it's 80% Palestinian, it's twice the size of Israel. It has the same flag, same culture, same language, Arabic, same religion, Sunni Islam, which is shared, by the way, by 22 countries. So it's like the Palestinians are Arabs, the part of the Arab Ummah, the part of the Muslim Ummah. The Muslim Ummah have 55 countries, more or less, 50 plus countries. The Arab League have more than 20 countries, all combined, much bigger than the United States and mostly empty. And still this local branch of the Arab world, of the Muslim world, needs to have its country, another 23rd Arab failed state that, will fall into civil war very soon, like the other ones. Another 50-something Muslim state on top of the only Jewish state, which is in the size of New Jersey, including the West Bank, it's in the size of New Jersey. This is ridiculous. And everywhere you dig in Israel, in the West Bank, you find, in Gaza Strip, you find ancient Jewish archaeological findings from thousands of years ago and from hundreds of years ago, from modern age, from ancient antiquity. This is the land that we are native to, Every nation has a place where they are native to, right? You can say the English-speaking people of the United States are originally mostly native to Britain, right? The Germans are native to Germany. The white Australians are also mostly native in Britain. Okay, so where's the Jews, wherever they are in the world? Where are their natives from? They are native from Judea. Every nation was created on a specific territory at some point, right? So, and I can go to all the history, but that's another point. And you also said about the recognition of Macron with a Palestinian state that don't exist. So it's kind of funny, but the same Macron is denying independence for a nation on the other side of the world, next to Australia, Nouvelle-Calédonie, New Caledonia. They are the native people of the Pacific Islands there. They've been occupied by the French Empire, and they are rising up in the last several years, protesting, demanding independence. And Macron and France denied them, refused to give them independence, despite the fact that they're on the other side of the world. France still has it's not only been an empire in the past, it is still an empire. It holds territories. The longest border of France is with Brazil, because it holds a huge territory in South America. Why they don't grant them independence? They own islands in the Caribbean. You have the island of Corsica in the Mediterranean that want independence, that have its own ethnic and national identity, closer to Italians than to French. And you have the Basque region that has nothing to do with French or Latin culture, and Brittany, which is Celt. And, so it's kind of phony. Same with Spain recognizing with a communist radical, what is the name of this communist prime minister of Spain? It's this really nasty lunatic, Pedro Sanchez. He recognized Palestinian state several years ago, but he denies independence for Catalonia and for the Basque territory that demand independence. So why is that? Isn't it a little bit phony? Same with the UK that denies independence for Scotland or letting them do a second referendum. So or Norway. Norway recognized a Palestinian state and it denies independence to the Sami people in northern Norway that are not Germanic, that are not Nordish. They have nothing to do with the Norwegian language. Their language is closer to Finnish. So there's a lot of, phoniness when it comes to these matters. And let's say that the Jewish people that were having, the worshiping in the first and second temple, that were fighting the Romans in the province of Judea, where, the whole world reads in the New Testament how Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew from Judea, from Nazareth, from the Roman province called Judea, right? So we have much more claim on this land that France has on the Pacific Islands, to say the least, okay? So, that kind of is frustrating. I'm sure that many people understand that. And I wanted to ask you about how do you compare from your experience being in Gaza with the Israeli army, and also, on the other hand, being a commander of British forces that work together with Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan. How do you compare the two armies when it comes to protecting civilian lives of enemy population? And when it comes to, for example, when there was let's say a Taliban or Al-Qaeda stronghold that you guys were besieging and trying to make them surrender, would the British and American army were supplying as much food and water to this besieged territory of Al-Qaeda or Taliban the same way that Israel does with Hamas and in Gaza territory, Hamas-controlled Gaza territory?
Before I answer that, I'll just pick you up on one point about Scotland. I agree with the comments you made about some of the other colonized territories around the world, but Scotland actually is not in that category. It's always been, it's not always been, but it was instrumental in forming the United Kingdom. So Scotland's not colonized by the UK.
Well, there was the Union, the Union of Crowns, and then the Union in the 18th century. It's not that long ago, the 18th century. Yeah. It's not like thousands of years. And there is many Scots that do demand independence and don't see themselves as part, of the English people. And they also demand a second referendum because of the outcome of Brexit. So, and the British government in London denies them for doing a referendum because in the aftermath of Brexit. So, again, it's not my business. I don't care either way. But look how you as a Brit become uncomfortable with that. So think about how Israelis feel daily when the whole world is, demanding us to give away our ancestral homeland, the heart of our ancestral homeland, Judea and Samaria, East Jerusalem, the land of our forefathers, which is 10 miles from Tel Aviv, which is the mountains overlooking Tel Aviv, which is cutting through our capital, Jerusalem, which is about a half of our current territory, which is already in the size of New Jersey. And in British terms, we are in the size of Wales when you include in the Israeli territory the West Bank.
I agree. I agree entirely with that. I don't want to go into any more rabbit holes about Scotland, but as far as Israel's concerned, the entirety of the land of Israel, from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea, is Israel. It's legally Israel. It's been the case since 1948. And there's been no
much longer before. It is legally binding to be recognized as Israeli Jewish territory since the British Mandate of Palestine giving to the United Kingdom in the aftermath of the San Remo Accords by the League of Nations.
Right.
The League of Nations, which was the precursor for the United Nations, had different mandates for different territories in the Middle East, split between French and Britain. And Britain got a hold of the British Mandate of Palestine. By the way, Palestine, naming it after the ancient Roman colonial name given to Judea in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century as a punishment for the Jews. Arabs cannot pronounce Palestine. They have no P. They have no P in their language. They cannot pronounce it because it's a Roman colonial name giving to humiliate the Jews after the Roman crash, the Jewish revolts in the 2nd century. And
right. But the point I was making was that since 1948, the modern day state of Israel has existed from its borders on the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. And there's been no international treaty or agreement of any sort that has changed that since then. So to say that there is a Palestinian state is simply false. And the likes of Macron recognizing a non-existent state, maybe in the future there will be, I don't know, but there isn't now. But to answer your question about whether we've, the British, the Americans, etc., fed people who were being besieged by our forces or under attack from our forces, I think I can say confidently that there's never been a military situation before, certainly not one that I know of, where an army that is carrying out combat operations in an area like Gaza has ever either been expected to or indeed has supplied its enemy population while the fighting's going on with food, with water, with other resources. That's never happened before. Israel has done it. The IDF has done it. I've been to the aid crossing points. I've visited inside Gaza the different roads and facilities that have been built by the IDF to accommodate and to facilitate aid delivery. And Israel does that. It's not obliged under international law to do that. And as I say, I don't think any other army ever has. In fact, the obligation on Israel in relation to delivery of aid into a combat zone is that Israel should facilitate aid being delivered to civilians, and that means really allow it to be delivered to civilians, not necessarily do it themselves, unless that aid is going to fall into the hands of the enemy or might fall into the hands of the enemy. And if that's the case, then Israel is not obliged to allow that aid to go in. And as we all know, most of the aid going into Gaza via the UN and other conventional aid agencies gets into the hands of Hamas one way or the other. So, but nevertheless, despite that,
That's very true. According to what you said, I think it's a part of the Geneva Convention. It's part of the international law that if your enemy is taking this aid, the enemy army or the terror organization, you are legally not required by international law to deliver this aid to the population, according to international law. And despite that, Israel does that from day one, supplies food and medicine and electricity and water that we do know that goes to Hamas, that Hamas is taking over it. So we are not obliged by international law, and we abide by international law, but we still do it. But yes, it's something very important. I want to ask you, when the British and American armies were besieging a specific town or village or a city in Afghanistan and Iraq, where there was a stronghold for Al-Qaeda, Taliban, ISIS, whatever, were they supplying food and water to this town that they were besieging?
No, of course not. And I mean, it's very difficult to make a comparison between Gaza and pretty much any other conflict, including Afghanistan and Iraq. There are similarities, but it's not a really close comparison to be made. the war, I think, in Afghanistan, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were generally more fluid than the situation we've got in Gaza. And there was never any suggestion that that Western forces were responsible for feeding the populations in areas that they were attacking. But as we've kind of touched on before, there's different rules for Israel. There's one rule for the rest of the world, and there's another completely different rule for Israel. And this comes back to what I was mentioning before about this very, very long-standing propaganda campaign under which international law has been twisted and falsified in order to get Israel into the dock and to get Israelis into the dock. And it's, you just look at things like these disgusting cries of genocide. That is the most shameful accusation being made on Israel. We know very well, and anyone that follows its situation, understands its situation, understands that the only people involved in this conflict who are attempting genocide are Hamas and their fellow terrorist groups. And that was demonstrated very adequately on the 7th of October 2023, and has been proven time and time again by their actions and by the words of their leadership, who the Hamas Charter requires the killing of Jews, not just Israelis, but Jews in Israel and around the world. So these are the genociders, yet it's Israel that's accused of genocide. And various countries, I think including Spain and Ireland, have even tried to redefine genocide so that it somehow can be made to fit the situation in Gaza. But this is the reality. This is the narrative of so much of the Western world today, that there are two standards. Well, there are probably three standards. One that applies to the West, one that applies to Israel, and then an all-forgiving standard that applies to Hamas and allows Hamas pretty much free, and other terrorists in the region, pretty much free reign to do whatever they like, as long as it's to Israel.
Spain should know better about what a real genocide is, as they're an expert of that when it comes to the Americas, Central, North America, South America. They kind of really genocide the local populations in a lot of places there, and left almost maybe 1% of the original native population. The Gaza Strip population grew in several percentages since October 7th. And it grew with hundreds of thousands and hundreds or maybe even thousands of percentage since 1948. This is, and 1967 also. This is ridiculous. There is no genocide where statistically the population is growing. It's impossible. In the eve of the World War II, 1939, there were 18 million Jews around the world. 6 years later, in 1945, there were 12 million Jews, and almost none of them lived in where it used to be the part of the Nazi Empire. Every third person in Warsaw was Jewish. A big chunk of Poland was Jewish. Today, you don't see a single Jew in Poland or in Warsaw. It's completely, the whole community, which my grandfather came from, of the Jewish population in Poland, completely wiped off the face of the earth. There were Jewish towns in Poland and Ukraine and across Eastern Europe called shtetls, which were mostly Jewish, and were dotted all across Eastern Europe. Not a single shtetl exists today. Not a single shtetl existed in 1945 at the aftermath of World War II. We are still, 70 years later, we're still not, or 80 years later, we're still not back to the numbers. We are the Jewish people, I'm saying, are not back to the numbers we were before 1939, before the Holocaust and World War II. Today, the estimation is 15 million Jews across the world. So still 3 million less than it was before the Holocaust. And there was 80 years. And now, since October 7th, the Palestinian population grew in Gaza. This is ridiculous. Israeli soldiers are killed daily because we don't want to hurt civilians through bombing from the air. So they're risking their lives and going in to scan the buildings from the inside and getting killed this way because we care so much about population of the enemy that hates us and massacred us. So, this is absurd. If we wanted to, Israel have very powerful weapons, include, the most powerful weapons in the world. Don't you think that in such a small territory, if we wanted to kill 100% of the population, we could have done so in about a week, probably less, right? This war would not have lasted 2 years. The reason it prolongs and stretches for so long is because of our care of our hostages and also the civilian population in Gaza, because it could have been over a few days after October 7 if we wanted to. So this is, really upsetting. As you can see, I'm very passionate about it. And I think a big part of this, rise of anti-Semitism or legitimization and normalizing of Nazism, communism, Islamism, and anti-Semitism in the West is a little small country that used to be part of the British Empire, and now Britain is part of their empire called Qatar. As a Brit, do you feel your country is under Qatari occupation? When I was last in London 2 years ago, everywhere I saw in Heathrow, in the billboards, in the buildings, in the hotels, in the restaurant, Qatar, 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 everything. It's a country of 300,000 citizens, by the way.
Yeah, I don't get the feeling that we're under occupation by Qatar. Of course, Qatar has huge investments in the UK, and the UK really, like other countries around the world, should be using the leverage that they should have with Qatar, partly because of the relationship between the two countries, to pressure them to do something about the Hamas leadership in Qatar. And of course, we know that. As well as Iran, Iran obviously is in a very different situation since the 12-day war, but as well as Iran and Turkey and a few other countries, Qatar has been the major sponsor of Hamas and one of the major supporters of Hamas. And I think that, the relationship between Britain and Qatar should be used to greater effect, but you won't get that. You simply won't get it because for reasons that I mentioned earlier on, the British government is kind of orientated against Israel, and this is a long-standing thing. That the British have had a checkered history in this region in relation to Israel and to the Jews before that, and you touched on it when you mentioned things like the Balfour Declaration, the San Remo Agreement, etc. Britain has tended to take, as a government at least, tended to take the side of the Arab world, and that's partly because of British. It has its origins in other perhaps more practical aspects like oil, but it's also partly because of the colonial guilt that is ladled onto the British people, and so Israel, as opposed to being Israel being a decolonizer, which is the reality, it decolonized basically the land that Israel now exists in. It's regarded as being a colony. It's being regarded as being, modern day colonizers, completely falsely. But that's the way it's seen by so many different people. And it started off, as we both spoke of, it started off back in the 1960s with the Soviet campaign against Israel, using Israel as a weapon against Britain and the United States in the Middle East. And all of these cries that we hear today about genocide, about apartheid, about illegal settlement, about illegal occupation, all of these things, these students in our university campuses and overgrown students in the UN and human rights organizations who are constantly chanting on the streets of Britain about from the river to the sea and these other things that I just mentioned. They were they don't know it, I don't suppose, but all these words originated in Moscow. All these phrases, all these slogans originated in Moscow. So they're parroting the original words of a somewhat a reasonably long deceased Soviet Union. And actually, this campaign, this anti-Israel campaign by the Soviet Union, was probably the most successful campaign of its type that they ever carried out, and they carried out many others, including creating, as I mentioned, creating wars of national liberation where they didn't exist.
Yeah, I find it hard to understand what is the colonization of the British Empire got to do. You know, colonization is a country leaving its native lands and colonizing in other lands, but keeping themselves to their, for example, the British colonization of the world, the UK, the British Isles stayed British, and then they you know, the empire spread out from Britain to North America while doing genocide to the Native Americans, and Australia, where they were doing genocide for the Aboriginals, and other places around the world. But the core stayed in London, in Britain. So if Israel is colonizer, where is the colonized home country that we're doing? That if we're colonizing in the Holy Land and it's not ours, on behalf of what? Where's the country that we are from? And we rule, and we're colonizing it on its behalf. This is ridiculous, because a lot of people say, "Oh, he just said his grandfather is from Poland." So first of all, both of my grandmothers were born in the Holy Land, and they were there for several generations. But today there is something called DNA, so we can see exactly where's the origins of each person without a question, right? Because this is science. When there is a lot of Nazi anti-Semitic conspiracies, for example, that the Ashkenazi people, I'm Ashkenazi Jews are not really Jews. They have nothing to do with the Israelites from the Bible, with the Jews from the time of Jesus, but rather they are a Khazari tribe that converted to Judaism. So there are several problems with that. The Khazars were Turkish people, Turkic. Turkey is one of the Turkic peoples, okay? So they were Turkic. So when you do the DNA test of Ashkenazi Jews, you don't find even 1%, less than 1% of Turkic DNA. And you find the core, the majority of the DNA comes from the Levant, which is the Eastern Mediterranean, the Holy Land area. That's the Levant. So you literally see it in the DNA of any types of Jews, Ashkenazi, Sephardi, that the majority and the core of our DNA is from the Levant, from the Holy Land. You know, this is kind of, you know, it's a fact. It's hard to dispute that. Anybody can go to ChatGPT or Google or Wikipedia and see what is Jewish DNA made of, Ashkenazi DNA, Sephardic DNA, and they can find it for themselves. But when it comes to Qatar, you know, it's this country which has only 300,000 citizens. Not a real country. It's like a big tribe. The rest are foreign workers or mostly treated as slaves. There's majority, you know, there's millions of slaves in this country from South Asia and Southeast Asia. And being LGBT is punishable by death. Practicing Christianity is punishable by death. Smuggling a Bible, you're not allowed to build a church. You're not allowed, again, to practice Christianity. They are the biggest sponsors of Hamas, the biggest sponsors of Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and ISIS. They're the biggest source of chaos and extremism in the Middle East after Iran, which is their best allies, by the way. They have a Nazi, anti-Semitic, anti-American, anti-Christian, anti-Western channel called Al Jazeera that has been banned in most Arab countries. They are part of the Muslim Brotherhood ideology that, again, is part of the regime in Turkey, but has been outlawed in all the other Middle Eastern Arab countries. because of its extremism, because it's basically the Muslim Brotherhood is the ideology of Hamas, is the ideology of ISIS, of Al-Qaeda. Why do these kind of people, and they still host, after October 7th, the leaders of Hamas on their soil? Theoretically, they could have ended the war the next day after October 7th. They can end the war today, tomorrow, if they do an ultimatum to the leaders, and also Turkey, that also hosts Hamas leaders. If Turkey and Qatar goes to the leaders of Hamas on their soil and tell them, either you are telling your guys in Gaza to surrender and leave on a ship or something that will take you somewhere, and release the hostages, Israeli hostages, or if you don't do this, we are extraditing you to the nearby American base. America has bases in both Qatar and in Turkey. So theoretically, they can extradite these people to America, and the war will be over in 5 minutes. And that will be that will release the hostages and end the suffering of the Palestinians in Gaza. But when they are going to London and other places in the West, they're getting red carpets and only praises and smiles, no demands. They don't have a problem to hosting in London the leaders of this country that fund terrorism and persecute LGBT people and persecute Christians. How so?
Well, this is the problem with in the West, including the UK and France and other countries, is they make no demands on the Arab countries, and they make no demands on Hamas. If you saw a recent statement put out by a number of Western countries condemning Israel, demanding an immediate ceasefire, there were no demands made against Hamas. There were only demands made against Israel. And effectively what they're saying...
And demands, by the way, I'm saying not to Hamas. It's a terror organization. What about demands to these two countries that have great relations with the West, Qatar and Turkey? Why about demands from them?
And those countries, as you said, are heavily involved in Hamas and Hamas's future. So the problem is a failure. Israel is the target of condemnation. Israel is the one that's always been asked to make concessions, to agree more, to give everything, in fact. Never the other side. It's always been that way. And that's, unfortunately, the mindset of Western politicians. Not every one of them, but many Western politicians. They think the problem is Israel, when in fact the problem is those people who want to bring Israel down. And the situation that we've got today in the Middle East, in Israel, in Judea and Samaria, in Gaza and elsewhere, has been perpetuated by this Western obsession with picking at Israel, with condemning Israel. That's why the situation has continued more and more. It encourages Hamas. If people like, and Hamas's supporters, if people like Macron and Starmer and their fellow political leaders condemn Israel, do they not think that has any effect on the war, on Hamas and on Hamas's supporters? Do they not think that's what strengthens them, perpetuates them, causes them to pull out of peace talks, which were going on almost right up until the time when these declarations came out, and particularly when Macron called for the recognition of a so-called Palestinian state. So these eternal peace processes who are obsessed with one thing, which is a two-state solution, which cannot now, in my view, ever occur, or certainly not in the foreseeable future. This is their obsession, and this is their demand that they make of Israel to concede to a Palestinian state, a two-state solution. And we had a two-state solution up until the 7th of October. We had a state in Gaza, which, as you said before, in 2005, 2006, was granted to the Palestinians. Israeli sovereign territory handed over to the Palestinians, and they turned it into a base to attack Israel. That's the two-state solution. And that's exactly the way a future two-state solution would work if it was allowed to take place, which is why there cannot be a two-state solution. And even that is ignoring the reality that the Palestinian leadership do not want a two-state solution. They want one thing only, and that's the annihilation of Israel. And I include not just Hamas in that, but also the Palestinian Authority and the different factions involved in that. They've been offered their own state many times, starting off in the 1930s, and they've turned it down repeatedly because they don't want it. They want one state, and that doesn't include Israel or the Jews.
So we are both conservatives. We've been attacked and vilified by the radical left for, years, both of us. And we're used to the shenanigans of the left and their anti-Semitism and their communism and their extremism and the woke, progressive, all this bullshit, and how they are, they sympathize with Hamas and with, with communist countries, with Islamist countries. Unfortunately, it's, the brainwashing universities. By the way, Qatar is the biggest sponsor of American Ivy League universities. So, we're used to Western universities brainwashing American youth, European youth to hate their countries, to hate their history, to hate their heritage, to hate Christianity, and of course, to hate Israel and the Jewish people. And it's kind of, it's been there for years, and they keep getting more radical and more radical and more communist and more anarchist, and, we're used to it. But in the last year, there is this growing faction, mostly in America, of what I call the woke right, the so-called hard right, that for some reason find itself agreeing more often than not with AOC and Bernie Sanders when it comes to economy, when it comes to America's negative impact in the world, in today's world and throughout history, and of course when it comes to Israel. So you have this horseshoe theory of the radical left and radical right coming to life, and they're connecting. So, as the left is becoming more kooky and more communist, this fringes in the right becoming more and more openly Nazi. We know that a lot of them are being sponsored by Qatar as well, especially in the podcast world. So, you are a Christian, and a lot of them are attacking Israel on behalf of, so-called their patriotism and their Christian faith, or even the Catholic faith. And you're a Catholic as well. So what do you have to say to that, or to them?
Well, of course, there are many Christians who attack Israel as well. And there are many who don't. In fact, in the United States of America, the largest pro-Israel organization, the largest Zionist organization is Christians United for Israel, by far the largest. So Israel's got many friends in the Christian world. But of course, many Christians are equally influenced by the woke and by the others who uphold the anti-Israel agenda. And there's a lot of different machinations behind it all. I think it's a lot of it, and it's not just doesn't just apply to Christians, but a lot of this is to do with people who have been subjected to this very, very long-term propaganda campaign against Israel, who just want to appear to be nice. They want to follow the crowd. They want people to think they're nice people. And the popular theory is that Israel's not nice. Israel is uniquely evil, and therefore they have to condemn it. So it's kind of an intellectual weakness, or indeed in many cases ignorance as well. But I don't think the majority. I would say I have no evidence to back this up, but I would say the majority of ordinary decent Christians who actually do follow what's going on and have some understanding, as opposed to what they watch on the BBC, would certainly not be attacking or condemning Israel. They might not like what's going on in Gaza, and who does like what's going on in Gaza? I don't think anybody likes what's going on in Gaza. But what anyone who understands the situation understands as well But everything that's going on in Gaza, all of the deaths, every single death, every hungry person, every person who had their house destroyed or the buildings destroyed, their schools destroyed, whatever, it's all down to Hamas. If Hamas had not attacked Israel on the 7th of October 2023, none of this death and destruction would have occurred. And if Hamas had not attempted back in 2006 onwards to turn Gaza into a engine of war to use solely against Israel, then Hamas could have been a deeply, deeply prosperous part of the world, as you said. I mentioned before. I think
Gaza,
the Qatar, the UAE, whatever of this part of the Middle East.
Yeah.
And people could, and I know for sure, and you probably know even better than I do, that Israel would have done everything it possibly could to have helped Gaza to become that. But, of course, that wasn't the case. And we're now where we are entirely because of Hamas and its supporters and its fellow terrorists' desire to eliminate the Jewish state.
The polls in America show that the overwhelming majority of Christians and conservatives, Republicans, and MAGA are supporting Israel. But you have this bubble of podcasters and YouTubers and accounts on X that are so-called Christian, so-called conservative. A lot of them are funded by Qatar, which is, again, a country that it is illegal to practice Christianity at. And they are inciting against Israel. So it's important to remember, for example, Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, it was under Israeli control until 1994, until the Oslo Accords. And under Israeli control, 80% of the population were Christians. Israel handed the control to the Palestinian Authority in 1994. And from 80% under Israeli control, today is less than 10% Christian. And Israel is the only place in the Middle East. Christians are being ethnically cleansed and genocide across the Middle East. In almost every Muslim country in the Middle East, the only country in the Middle East that the Christian population is growing and thriving is Israel. The only place where Christians in the Middle East and Christian holy sites in the Middle East is safe and protected is Israel. The Christians went to crusade to the Holy Land because the Muslims wouldn't let them worship in the Christian holy sites in Jerusalem and elsewhere. So, this is absurd. The Palestinians are persecuting Christians, and most Christians, Palestinians fled since the creation of the Palestinian Authority from Gaza and from the West Bank. So, it's important facts to remember, and that Jesus was Jewish, and all of his disciples were Jewish, including St. Paul. So, and the whole New Testament was written by Jews. So, this is also a small fact that's important to remember. Colonel Richard Kemp, it was such a pleasure having you here, and we'll see you again in this podcast, I hope. And it was fascinating. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. Good to be with you, Yair.
Thanks.